I didn't touch her.
You molested me!
She tried to make advances at me. When I warned her to stop, she started screaming.
He's lying! He is lying! Oh, God.
Please, sir, what's the issue?
She stood in the middle of that office hallway, pointed her finger directly at the man who had spent 15 years building that company from the ground up, and screamed the words that would unravel his entire life in under 60 seconds. He molested me. For words. That is all it took. Security came running before the echo had even settled into the walls. Her hands were shaking. Her voice cracked at exactly the right moment. And before anyone in that building had time to process what they were watching, the man whose name was on the company lease, whose signature appeared on every single paycheck in that building, was being escorted out of his own front door in front of the very people he had personally hired. And every single person standing in that hallway believed what they were seeing. Nobody questioned it. Nobody asked for a moment to think. Because when a woman stands in a professional building and screams those words with that kind of force, the instinct of everyone around her is to respond first and ask questions later. Imani Carter understood that better than anyone. But here is what none of them knew standing in that hallway on that afternoon. This was not the first time she had done something like this. It was not the second time either. It was the third time in the same building, involving a different target, using a pattern so consistent across each situation that anyone who had taken the time to look at all three of them side by side would have seen immediately that the similarity was not coincidence. Before Darnell Reeves was walked out of that front door, two women had already been walked out before him. Both of them professionals, both of them respected, both of them gone from careers they had worked years to build, without either of them ever fully understanding what had actually happened to them while it was happening. And the woman responsible for all three outcomes had sat quietly in the middle of each situation, trusted by everyone around her, leaving nothing on the surface that would give anyone watching a clear reason to look more carefully at what she was doing underneath. This is not a simple story about a false accusation, and it would be a mistake to treat it as one. This is a story about the specific kind of power that lives inside institutions and organizations, the kind that does not announce itself, the kind that operates through paperwork and testimony and carefully managed relationships rather than through anything loud or obvious. It is a story about how a person can become genuinely dangerous inside a professional environment when they are patient enough, observant enough, and willing enough to use the trust of the people around them as a tool rather than a bond. And it is a story about how one woman, the one person in the entire organization who had the most personal reason to be emotional and reactive, chose instead to be methodical and quiet and thorough in a way that ultimately proved more powerful than anything the justice system produced on its own. By the time you reach the end of what we are about to tell you, you will not be sitting with a simple verdict in your mind. You will be sitting with a question that is harder than guilty or not guilty, which is this. How does someone operate the way Imani Carter operated for as long as she operated, inside a building full of intelligent professional people, without anyone connecting what was happening until it was already 3 victims deep? And what does the answer to that question tell us about every organization most of us walk into every single day of our working lives? Hold those questions. We are going to answer every one of them. But first, you need to understand who these people were before any of this happened, because none of it makes sense without the full picture. Before we go any further into this story, let us know in the comments where you are watching from right now. We want to hear from you, whether you are watching from New York or Georgia or California or anywhere else across this country and beyond. And if you are new here and this kind of storytelling is what you have been looking for, do not forget to follow or hit that subscribe button right now so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Now let us go back to the very beginning. There are 3 people at the center of this story, and each of them believed, at different points across its timeline, that they had the situation fully under control. The first is Imani Carter, a woman whose ability to walk into any professional environment and immediately become the most trusted person in it was so consistent and so effortless that the people who worked alongside her talked about it the way people talk about a natural gift. She remembered names the first time she heard them. She remembered the details people shared about their lives outside of work, the kids, the anniversaries, the health situations they mentioned once in passing, and she brought those details back up at exactly the right moments in exactly the right ways to make whoever she was speaking to feel genuinely seen and genuinely valued. That quality is not a small thing in any organization. The people who possess it move through professional environments with an ease that others spend entire careers trying to manufacture, and Imani had possessed it from the very beginning of her working life. But Imani Carter also understood something about professional environments that most people who simply work inside them never fully examine. She understood that the most durable kind of power in any organization is not the kind that sits at the top of an organizational chart with a title attached to it. That kind of power is visible, scrutinized, and ultimately answerable to someone above it. The most durable kind of power is the kind that sits in the middle, close enough to the top to matter, trusted by the people above it, relied upon by the people below it, and invisible enough to the people outside it that nobody ever thinks to question what it is actually doing when nobody important is watching. Human resources, in almost every organization that has one, is exactly that kind of power. And Imani Carter had understood that from the first year of her professional career. The second person at the center of this story is Darnell Reeves, the director and co-founder of the company where all of this unfolded. A man whose professional reputation over 15 years had been built on a foundation of consistent fairness and genuine accountability. Darnell was not a distant leader. He was not the kind of director who operated from behind a closed door and communicated through intermediaries. He knew his employees, not as entries on an organizational chart, but as people, with histories and pressures and lives that extended beyond the 8 or 9 hours they spent inside his building every day. He had built his company on the belief that how you treat people when they are working for you is not separate from your professional character, but a direct expression of it. And that belief had shaped every significant decision he had made as a leader from the day the company opened its doors. 15 years of operating that way had produced a culture that most people inside his organization were genuinely proud to be part of, and a reputation in the industry that carried real weight. It had also produced, without his realizing it, a blind spot. The third person is Aaliyah Reeves, Darnell's wife and the quiet co-architect of everything he had ever built professionally. Aaliyah had been with Darnell since before the company had a name, since the years when a business plan was a set of handwritten notes on a kitchen table and the budget was a shared savings account that they both held their breath over every month. She had done the early bookkeeping, managed the first client relationships, answered phones and written proposals, and done every unglamorous thing that a new business requires in the years before it has the resources to hire anyone else to do those things. By the time the company had grown into the operation it eventually became, Aaliyah had stepped back from the daily work to pursue other interests, content to let Darnell run what they had built together while she remained, as she had always been, the steadier and more watchful of the two. Stepping back from daily operations, though, had never meant that she had stopped paying attention. That was a mistake anyone who underestimated Aaliyah Reeves had consistently made, and it was the last mistake Imani Carter would ever make professionally. So here are the questions that this story is actually asking. How many careers did Imani Carter dismantle before anyone in a position to stop her ever looked closely enough at the pattern she was leaving behind? Did Darnell Reeves actually do what she stood in that hallway and claimed he had done? Or was he simply the most powerful name remaining on a list she had been quietly working through since the day she first walked into that building? And when Aaliyah Reeves made the decision to walk back into that same company under a name that was not her own, was she going there simply to fight for her husband? Or had she seen something in the situation that everyone else around her had missed, and decided that the only way to surface it was to go and find it herself? Every one of those questions is going to be answered before this story ends. But first, you need to understand who these people were before the story began. Imani Carter grew up in a household where ambition was never the problem. Her mother worked 2 jobs for most of Imani's childhood, taking buses before the sun came up and arriving home in the evenings with a tiredness in her body that she never once let touch her face in front of her children. She did work that other people considered beneath serious professional consideration, and she did it with a consistency and a dignity that Imani watched carefully from the time she was old enough to understand what she was watching. But Imani also watched the other things. She watched promotions go to people who worked less carefully and less consistently than her mother, simply because those people knew the right individuals or had attended the right schools or had grown up in households where being seen and considered was simply the expected outcome rather than something to be earned against resistance. She watched her mother smile at people who barely acknowledged her existence, and she made a decision, somewhere around the age of 12, that would quietly shape the direction of the next 20 years of her life. She was never going to be the one smiling at someone who did not see her. She was going to be the one deciding who got to be seen. That decision was not, in itself, a wrong one. Millions of people grow up with exactly that kind of fire and directed into legitimate achievement, building careers and businesses and professional lives that reflect their capability and their work ethic honestly. The decision becomes something else entirely when the fire behind it is combined with a willingness to harm the people standing between you and the outcome you are moving toward, and a patience skilled enough to make that harm look, every single time, like something that simply happened rather than something that was carefully arranged. Imani Carter had that patience from early on. She had practiced it in small ways throughout school, in the way she managed friendships when friendships became competitive, in the way she navigated group dynamics when those dynamics produced winners and losers. By the time she entered the professional world, she had developed it into something far more refined than most people her age possessed, and she walked into her first real office job already knowing more about how to use a professional environment to her own advantage than most of the people inside it had learned in years of working there. Her first corporate position was administrative, an entry-level role in a mid-sized company that she treated with the same focused intensity most people reserve for roles they actually consider important. She spent the first 6 months simply watching. She watched who held informal power versus formal authority. She watched whose opinions carried weight in meetings regardless of title. She watched which complaints got elevated and which ones disappeared, and more importantly, she watched who controlled the process of elevation and disappearance and what that control actually looked like from the inside. She identified the HR department as the center of what she was looking for within the first year, not because of anything obvious about the role, but because of what she could see the person occupying it was actually able to do. They could shape how complaints were framed before they reached the decision makers. They could control the pace and direction of internal investigations. They could influence which voices were heard and how those voices were presented and in what context. All of that, dressed in the perfectly reasonable language of procedure and policy, and answerable, ultimately, only to people who almost never looked closely enough at the details to understand what the person at the center of it was actually doing with all of that discretion. She set her course toward HR with the patience of someone who understood that arriving at the right destination too quickly draws attention, and attention was the one thing she was never willing to risk. She took on administrative support tasks that touched the edges of the HR function. She volunteered for projects that gave her exposure to the processes she needed to understand. She built relationships with the people whose institutional knowledge she needed to absorb, positioning herself as someone eager to learn from their experience. And when the opportunity came to move formally into the HR function in an assistant capacity, she was ready for it in a way that looked entirely natural from the outside, because she had been preparing for it for 2 years. The HR manager at that time was a woman named Renee, and Renee is the first person in this story whose life Imani Carter took apart piece by piece before moving on to the next one. Renee had been with the company for 15 years, the kind of institutional knowledge that organizations depend on without fully appreciating until it is gone. She was known for being thorough, fair, and genuinely invested in the well-being of the people she served, qualities that made her effective and that also, it turned out, made her almost completely unprepared for the specific kind of colleague Imani was going to become. Renee liked Imani the way experienced professionals sometimes like someone who appears to be exactly what they need at exactly the right time. She was warm, mentoring, generous with her knowledge and her time. She showed Imani the systems, explained the reasoning behind the procedures, and over many months trusted her with increasing levels of access and responsibility. She did not know that every piece of knowledge she shared was being cataloged and repurposed in real time. Imani spent a full year studying Renee before she did anything visible. That year was not idle time. She was learning the specific language that made complaints land with management. She was identifying which executives had the least patience for what they considered HR drama and which ones responded most strongly to concerns framed in terms of legal risk. She was building individual relationships with employees across multiple departments, the kind of relationships that felt personal and trusting from the outside, but that were, in reality, being maintained with a specific long-term purpose in mind. She knew that when the time came, she would need people who trusted her enough to share their workplace frustrations in candid terms, because those candid frustrations, carefully selected, carefully framed, and carefully attributed, would become the raw material for what she was going to build against Renee. The complaints against Renee began to emerge slowly. A comment from one employee, relayed to management through Imani, about feeling that disciplinary processes were being handled inconsistently. A concern from another, passed along in a meeting Imani attended in a support capacity, about what the employee described as favoritism in how certain situations were being assessed. None of these complaints were fabricated from nothing. The most effective version of what Imani did was never outright fabrication. It was selection, emphasis, and framing. She found the grievances that existed in every workplace, the natural frustrations and the genuine misunderstandings, and she chose the ones that pointed in the direction she needed, amplified them through repetition and careful language, and presented them to the right people at the right time in the right format. Renee was never given a chance to understand what was happening because the process was designed to conclude before she had time to build a defense. By the time the formal concerns had accumulated enough weight to reach the senior management team in organized form, Renee was already behind in a race she had not known she was running. The investigation that followed was handled with the kind of procedural correctness that looks thorough from a distance but that operates, in practice, on the information it is given, and the information it was given had been shaped from the beginning by the person who now had more knowledge of the systems and the personalities involved than almost anyone else in the building. Renee resigned before the investigation concluded, explaining to the few colleagues she was close enough to be honest with that she simply could not continue putting energy into fighting something she did not fully understand, in a system that did not seem to be responding to her side of the story. She had been at the company for 15 years. She left in a matter of months, carrying with her a quiet injury to her professional confidence that she would spend the next several years trying to understand and recover from. She was the first. Carol came in from outside the company, recruited specifically because of her reputation for handling complex and sensitive employee situations with thoroughness and professionalism. She had a background that Renee had not had, a formal training in organizational psychology alongside her HR experience, and she came into the role with a sharper eye for the dynamics of workplace relationships than most people who had occupied the position before her. From the very beginning, she was more careful and more questioning than Renee had been, and Imani recognized that almost immediately. What Imani had been able to execute quickly against Renee would need to move more slowly against Carol, because Carol asked follow-up questions, and Carol reviewed original documentation rather than accepting summaries of it. And Carol had a habit of going back to the source of a concern and verifying it independently rather than taking the framing of a concern at face value. So Imani waited. She continued operating in her role with the same competence and attentiveness she had always displayed. She was warm toward Carol, supportive of her transition into the department, and patient in a way that Carol would later describe as something she had noticed but had not been able to name as suspicious because it never crossed any line that she could point to directly. It simply felt, Carol would say years later, like someone who was always perfectly positioned, always one step ahead of the situation in a way that she had originally attributed to experience and genuine capability before she understood what was actually behind it. The complaints against Carol, when they began, were more sophisticated than the ones against Renee had been, because Imani had learned from the first experience what worked and what could be improved. She introduced procedural concerns this time, specific documentation irregularities that were technically accurate but had been selected and framed to look like systemic failures of management judgment rather than the natural complexity of a busy HR department managing a large and varied workforce. She raised concerns about the handling of certain sensitive employee situations through the same informal channels she had used before, this time with slightly more distance between herself and the formal record of who had raised what concern and when. Carol felt, during this period, the way a person feels when they are being watched but cannot locate the source of the watching. She increased her own documentation, her own record-keeping, her own procedural thoroughness, all of which, perversely, simply gave Imani more material to point to as evidence of someone who was struggling to manage their role rather than someone who was trying to protect themselves from something they could feel but could not see. Carol lasted 8 months before the accumulated pressure became heavier than the position was worth. She did not fully understand, even at the moment of her resignation, the mechanism that had produced her exit. She knew that something had been wrong in that department, and that she had been unable to identify its source clearly enough to address it. She knew that her own record had been more carefully scrutinized than she would have expected for someone in their first year in a new role. She knew that she had tried, once, to raise a concern with a senior manager about what she thought she was observing in the patterns of complaint and documentation around her, and that she had been told, quietly and firmly, to focus on her own performance rather than speculating about the motivations of her colleagues. That conversation had been the moment Carol understood that she had already lost whatever ground she had been trying to hold. She resigned with a professionalism that masked everything she was actually feeling, and she walked out of the building carrying the particular kind of damage that comes from losing something without being able to fully explain to anyone, including yourself, exactly what happened to you. She was the second. Now let us talk about Darnell Reeves at this point in the story, because Darnell Reeves was the director of this company through all of it, and his absence from the pattern is itself a significant part of what made the pattern possible. Darnell trusted the people around him deeply, not naively in the sense of being blind to the existence of professional misconduct, but in the more specific sense of operating from a default of good faith unless given a clear and direct reason to do otherwise. He had run his company on that default for 15 years, and it had served him well, because most people, in most professional environments, most of the time, are operating in good faith. The problem with the default of good faith is what happens in the rare cases where someone is deliberately exploiting it, because the default itself becomes a protective mechanism for the person doing the exploiting. Darnell was aware, in a general sense, that 2 HR managers had departed from the department in a relatively short period of time. He had been involved in both departures at a procedural level, reviewing the investigations, considering the recommendations, approving the outcomes. But the information he had been given in each case had been processed through a department in which Imani Carter was, by the time of Carol's exit, the single most knowledgeable and most trusted person remaining. He had never been given a reason to look at the 2 situations together rather than separately. He had never been given a reason to consider the one constant between them as a potential variable in what had produced both outcomes. He promoted Imani into the HR manager position because she was, on every piece of paper and in every recommendation he received, simply the most qualified person available. He believed he was making a good decision for his company. He had no idea that the decision was the conclusion of a plan that had been running for years directly underneath him. The shift in Imani's approach toward Darnell after she took the HR manager position did not happen overnight. It moved the way everything she did moved, slowly, carefully, and in stages designed to look like the natural development of a professional relationship rather than a deliberate escalation. In the first months after her promotion, she was exactly the HR manager she had always appeared to be: thorough, responsive, available, the kind of department head that a director like Darnell genuinely appreciated because she made his own work easier and his employees' concerns feel heard. She handled situations fairly, built goodwill across multiple departments, and gave him no reason whatsoever to examine anything she was doing with any more scrutiny than he gave anything else running smoothly inside his operation. The attentiveness toward Darnell personally began quietly, in the way it always begins when someone is managing the impression they are making rather than simply being present in a relationship. She noted the kinds of things he mentioned in passing during meetings and found ways to reference them later in ways that made him feel listened to. She made herself available for conversations that went slightly beyond the scope of what was strictly necessary for the business at hand. Nothing inappropriate, nothing that could be pointed to as a clear boundary crossing. Simply a consistent presence and a quality of engagement that began, over time, to feel different from the professional warmth she extended to everyone else. Darnell was a busy man. He processed most of what happened around him in terms of the work it related to and the people it involved, and the idea that a professional interaction might be carrying a different weight underneath its professional surface simply did not occur to him to examine, because it had never occurred to him before. The late evenings in the office began innocuously. End-of-quarter reviews, budget cycles, strategic planning sessions that ran past the point where the rest of the building had emptied out. Imani was always willing to stay, always prepared, always effective in those sessions in ways that made the extended time genuinely productive for the business. Darnell thought of those evenings as simply part of what it looked like to have a genuinely committed senior employee, because that is what he had always thought it looked like, and he had no framework for understanding it as anything else. But in those evenings, across weeks and then months, something in the atmosphere of those sessions was changing in a way that Darnell could feel without being able to name. A shift in the quality of the silences between conversations, in the way the physical space of the room felt different than it had felt in earlier meetings. He pushed the feeling aside each time it arose because there was always work in front of him, and he was always focused on the work. That focus, which had served him so consistently throughout his professional life, kept him from examining what he was sensing long enough for the situation to move to its next stage. The comments that Imani began allowing herself to make, carefully and progressively, were designed with an understanding of the specific kind of man Darnell Reeves was. She did not approach him the way someone might approach a man who was vain about his power or susceptible to obvious flattery. She approached the part of him that she had spent months studying carefully, the part that was genuinely tired from the weight of leadership, that occasionally felt the particular loneliness that comes with being the person responsible for everything in an organization, and that responded to the feeling of being genuinely understood rather than simply professionally respected. Her comments touched that place with a precision that was not accidental. She spoke about how rare it was to encounter someone in his position who still treated the people around him the way he treated them. She spoke about what she imagined it must be like to carry the kind of responsibility he carried without anyone around him who fully understood what that felt like from the inside. She said these things in moments of apparent candor, as though she was simply being honest in a way she did not normally allow herself to be, and she watched to see how he received them. Darnell received them with the politeness and the brief warmth that he received most things, and moved the conversation back to professional ground each time without appearing to consciously choose to do so. He was not processing what was happening. That was the clearest indication, to anyone who might have been watching from the outside, that the situation was moving in a direction he had not recognized. A man who had recognized the shift would have closed the conversation down, created distance, addressed the dynamic directly. Darnell did none of those things because he had genuinely not yet understood what was happening, and Imani had been careful enough, patient enough, and skilled enough at reading his responses to ensure that she never moved fast enough to trigger the recognition before she was ready for it. The evening that everything shifted beyond the point of ambiguity began, for Darnell, exactly like dozens of evenings before it. It was a Thursday in the autumn, the building quiet and largely empty around them, the two of them working through year-end projections at the conference table in his office. He was focused on the numbers in front of him, annotating a document he needed to review before the following morning, when Imani said something that had nothing to do with the numbers. It was not framed carefully. It was not ambiguous. It was a direct statement of intent that landed in the room between them with a weight that instantly reorganized everything he thought he had understood about the preceding months. Everything he had noticed without examining, everything he had felt and pushed aside, arrived in his understanding simultaneously and completely, like a picture that had been building one piece at a time finally assembling itself into a form he could no longer misread. He stood up from the table. He created physical distance between them, moving to the other side of the room, and he said, clearly and without hesitation, that this was not something he was willing to engage with in any capacity, that it would not be happening, and that they both needed to treat this moment as the end of anything that had been building toward it and return to a professional working relationship going forward. He was not cruel about it. He was not dismissive in a way designed to humiliate her. He was firm and direct in the way he was firm and direct about most things he had decided, and when he finished speaking he waited to see how she responded. She gathered her things from the table slowly and calmly. She met his eyes once, with an expression he could not read, and then she said good night and left his office, pulling the door closed behind her without another word. The silence that followed her exit was the kind that carries a weight out of proportion to the quiet it contains, and it stayed with him long after he left the building that evening and drove home to a house where Aaliyah was waiting. He told Aaliyah that night, not everything, not in detail, but enough, and she listened to him the way she always listened when something important was being said, fully and without filling the space with her own reactions until he had finished speaking. She asked him 2 questions. The first was whether he was going to involve the company's legal team. The second was whether he trusted the process he was about to put in motion to protect him the way it was supposed to. He said yes to the first question and yes to the second. Aaliyah said nothing more about the second answer that evening, but she thought about it for the rest of the night in a way that told her the answer she had been given was based on an assumption about how systems work that she was not entirely sure was correct. The documentation and legal consultation began the following week. Darnell's legal team advised a specific process, a recorded account of the incident, formal documentation filed with the appropriate internal channels, a managed termination that followed procedure carefully enough to be unimpeachable from an employment law perspective. Darnell followed every step of that advice with the same methodical care he applied to every significant business decision. He believed, as he had always believed, that having done nothing wrong meant that nothing wrong could ultimately happen to him as a result of this situation, that the facts, properly documented and properly handled, would simply produce the correct outcome. He could not have known, sitting in his lawyer's office following that careful advice, that the woman he was moving to terminate had spent years inside the very systems he was relying on to protect him, and that she understood the gaps in those systems in ways that no amount of proper procedure was going to fully close. Imani received the formal termination notification 3 weeks later. The meeting in which it was delivered was attended by 2 members of the company's legal team and an independent HR consultant who had been brought in specifically to ensure the process was handled without any potential procedural vulnerability. Imani listened to the notification with a composure that the consultant who delivered it would later describe as striking, not in the sense of being inappropriate, but in the sense of being almost completely unrelated to the weight of what was being communicated. She asked a small number of procedural questions. She thanked the people in the room for their time. She collected her personal items from her office in the days that followed without incident or apparent distress, and she left the building for the last time with an expression that a security guard who saw her exit would later describe as thoughtful rather than upset. The guard had worked in that building for 7 years, and had seen a lot of people leave under difficult circumstances. He said that in his experience, the ones who left looking thoughtful were always the ones who were not done yet. He was right. The message requesting a final meeting arrived in Darnell's email 12 days after the termination had been finalized. It was brief, professionally worded, and framed as a request for an opportunity to speak one last time before Imani moved forward with her life, to clear the air, to end things without the residue of unfinished business between 2 people who had worked together for years. The email closed with an apology for the discomfort the situation had caused. Darnell's legal counsel read it and advised him to decline. They explained their reasoning carefully, walked him through the risk of any informal communication with a recently terminated employee, and told him directly that there was nothing to be gained from that meeting and a great deal that could go wrong. Darnell thanked them for their advice. And then he agreed to the meeting anyway. He would be asked, many times in the months that followed, why he had done that. His answer was always the same. He had built his entire career on the belief that people deserve to be treated with basic human dignity even in difficult professional circumstances, and declining to allow a former employee to say what she needed to say before she moved on felt like a violation of that belief that he was not willing to carry. His lawyers called it a serious misjudgment. People who understood what was actually coming called it something that cannot be politely named. Darnell called it the only choice consistent with the kind of person he had spent 15 years trying to be. Whatever it was called, it opened the door to the single most consequential 40 minutes of his professional life, and he walked through it with his eyes open and his guard down, in good faith, one last time. She arrived at the building looking exactly as she had always looked during her years of working there. Composed, well-presented, carrying herself with the ease of someone returning to a familiar environment rather than someone entering a building from which they had recently been removed. The receptionist who buzzed her through recognized her and greeted her warmly. The security guard who rode the elevator with her noted nothing unusual about her demeanor. She walked down the corridor toward Darnell's office without hesitation, knocked once, and was let in. The door closed behind her. What happened in the 20 minutes that followed inside that office is something that only two people know with certainty, and only one of them has ever told a consistent version of what those 20 minutes contained. The other one told a version that shifted in its details across every subsequent telling, in ways that nobody in that building was equipped to notice at the time, because what happened immediately afterward left no space for anyone to think carefully about anything. The door came open fast and hard against the wall behind it, and the sound of it brought three people out of their offices into the hallway before the echo had finished. What they saw was Imani Carter moving out of that office with a visible physical urgency, her composure gone, her face carrying an expression they had none of them ever seen on her before, and her voice, when it came, was not the controlled and measured voice they had all associated with her for years. It was broken and high, and it carried the words like something that had been held back past the point of containment. He molested me. The three people in the hallway stood completely still for a moment, the way people stand when the information reaching them is too large to process through normal channels in real time. And then they moved, because standing still was not an option anyone's nervous system could sustain in the face of what they were watching. Security was contacted. The HR consultant who had handled the termination was unreachable. Two senior managers arrived within minutes, neither of them knowing exactly what protocol to follow in a situation this specific, both of them following the instinct that the first priority was to separate the two people involved and ensure that whatever had happened was not continuing to happen. Darnell emerged from his office and stood in the doorway of it, and the people who were there that afternoon would struggle afterward to find a single word that captured his expression. Not guilty, not frightened, simply unmade, in the way that a person looks when something has happened to them that their entire model of how the world works is unable to accommodate. The accusation traveled through the company before the afternoon was over. It traveled through the industry by the following morning. It reached social media within 48 hours, moving through the particular channels where stories about powerful men behaving badly move fastest, accumulating commentary and assumption and judgment from people who had no direct knowledge of anyone involved, but who had very strong feelings about what the situation represented, which is true of almost every story that moves this way. Darnell's name, which had been attached to the language of fairness and achievement for a decade and a half, was now attached to the language of allegation, and the two associations do not sit comfortably side by side, no matter how much context surrounds them. The board convened within 48 hours. They did not convene to investigate. They convened to make a decision about what the company's public position needed to be in a situation where delay itself carried reputational cost, and the decision they arrived at, after several hours of discussion that Darnell was not present for, was the one that organizations in this position almost always arrive at. They removed him from his role as director, not because the investigation had concluded, not because any evidence had been formally assessed, but because the accusation was public enough and the coverage was moving fast enough that leaving him in place would be interpreted by every audience that mattered to them commercially and reputationally as a decision to side with the accused before the facts had been established. It was a risk calculation, not a moral judgment, though the outcome looked exactly the same from every direction. Darnell came home that second evening to find Aaliyah waiting in the kitchen the same way she had been waiting the first evening, with a stillness that was not passivity but preparation. She had been watching the coverage develop across the day, tracking it with the particular attention of someone who is reading between the lines of every public statement rather than simply absorbing the surface of them. She had already made several calls to people she trusted, gathering information that the public record was not yet reflecting. By the time Darnell walked through the door, she had a clearer picture of what was happening and what was likely to happen next than most of the lawyers on his team had yet assembled. She let him speak first. She listened to all of it. And then she said, quietly, that she needed him to trust her with something she was planning to do, and that she needed him not to ask her too many questions about it yet. The months that followed the accusation were the kind that leave permanent marks on everything they touch, not just on reputation and career, but on the texture of daily life in ways that are harder to name and harder to recover from than professional setbacks. Their children navigated school with the particular burden of a parent's name in headlines, old enough to read and to hear the things said around them, not old enough to have developed the distance that makes public scrutiny survivable. Friends who had been consistent presences went quiet in the gradual, undeclared way that is more painful than an argument because it happens without any moment you can point to and address directly. Business relationships that had been built over years went into a kind of neutral suspension, with partners saying all the right things about believing in due process, while taking every practical step available to them to reduce their association with anything connected to the case until it resolved. The investigation was formally underway, but its pace was slow and its challenges were significant. Imani gave her account across multiple recorded sessions. Investigators who reviewed those sessions noted, in internal communications that would later become relevant, that her account showed a consistency in its broad outline that is generally considered a marker of truthful recall, but a variability in its specific details that is generally considered a marker of something else. The specific time at which certain things happened. The precise location within the room of various objects and people at key moments. The sequence in which certain events occurred. These details shifted across sessions in ways that each, individually, could be attributed to the imprecision of memory under stress, but that collectively, when mapped against each other, produced a picture that was harder to explain in those terms. The single most important early development in the investigation came from a coworker who came forward voluntarily, approximately 3 weeks after the incident, to provide a statement that she had heard raised voices coming from Darnell's office on the afternoon in question. The statement was specific, located in time with enough precision to be corroborating, and its appearance in the investigation record temporarily gave the case against Darnell a structural support it had been lacking. Investigators incorporated it into their analysis. It was referenced in multiple subsequent documents. It shaped the direction of several interviews that followed it. For a period of weeks, it functioned as the piece of corroboration that made the investigation feel like it was pointing somewhere specific and supported. The problem emerged when investigators began the routine process of cross-referencing witness accounts against building access records. The coworker who had placed herself in the building on the afternoon in question had not, according to the electronic key card system that logged every entry and exit from every secured area of the building, actually been present in the building during the window she described. Her card had not been used that afternoon. Her workstation had no logged activity during the relevant time. When contacted about the discrepancy, she was initially defensive, then distressed, and finally, in a second interview conducted with considerably more care for the weight of what she was about to say, she admitted that the account she had provided had not been based on direct observation. It had been based on details that Imani had shared with her in a private conversation in the days following the incident, described by Imani in terms that the coworker had understood to be Imani's account of what had happened, and which the coworker had then repeated in her own statement as though they were things she had witnessed herself, without clearly distinguishing between the two. She had not, she insisted, understood what she was doing as providing false testimony. She had believed she was supporting a colleague whose account she trusted. The retraction of that statement was significant. But here is what matters about the retraction that the coverage of the investigation never adequately reflected. The retraction of false corroboration does not restore the situation to zero. It removes a piece of support from one side of the scale, but the damage that the original statement caused, the direction it gave to the investigation, the credibility it temporarily lent to the overall account, the effect it had on the perception of everyone who had read it before it was retracted, none of that is undone by the correction that follows. The investigation continued. The lawsuit, which had been filed separately through Imani's legal team and moved on its own procedural timeline, continued. Darnell sat in a house he had built the same way he had built everything in his life, slowly and carefully, and with the expectation that doing things right was its own protection, and he waited for a system he had always believed in to produce the outcome he was certain it was designed to produce. And Aaliyah, who believed in him completely but was not willing to simply wait, was already at work. The decision Aaliyah made was not reactive. It did not come from a place of panic or desperation or the kind of emotional urgency that produces decisions people later regret. It came from a clear-eyed assessment of what the current situation was actually producing versus what it needed to produce, and from an understanding of where the gap between those two things was located. The investigation had lost its primary corroborating witness. The case was technically still moving forward, But without that witness testimony, it was structurally dependent on Imani's account standing alone against Darnell's. And in a he said, she said situation where one party carries the social weight of an accusation and the other carries the social weight of a position of institutional authority, the formal apparatus of investigation does not always produce an outcome that reflects the actual truth of what happened. Aaliyah knew that. She had watched enough of the process unfold to understand it clearly. And she had begun to understand that the information most likely to change the direction of the case was not going to come through the investigation or through the legal process. It was going to come from inside the company's own records. The question was how to access those records in a form that would actually be usable. She held a legal stake in the company as its co-founder. She had never formally relinquished that stake or the operational access that came with it. But walking in through the front door as Darnell Reeves's wife and co-owner, in the middle of a publicly reported accusation against her husband, was not a way to access anything quietly. Every door that mattered would be managed with a care specifically calibrated to her status as an interested party, and the information she needed was the kind that only became visible when nobody was managing it for an audience. She needed to go in as no one. She needed to be unremarkable enough in her role that the people around her said what they said and did what they did without the adjustment that comes when someone important is present. She needed to be inside the building the way Imani had always been inside it, visible and trusted and completely underestimated. She applied using her maiden name, building a resume around the genuine experience she had accumulated in the company's early years without referencing the company or her co-founder status directly. The experience was real. The skills were current. The resume stood on its own merits without requiring any supplementary explanation, and the offer came back within 2 weeks of her application. Entry level, HR department, exactly the access point she needed. She accepted it without hesitation and began 2 weeks later, arriving on her first day in a building where her husband's portrait still hung in the lobby slightly to the left of the main entrance. A framed photograph from a company anniversary celebration 3 years earlier, in which he was smiling in a way she had seen 1,000 times in person and had been missing every single day of the month since all of this had begun. Her daily experience inside that department required a quality of emotional discipline that is genuinely difficult to describe from the outside. She sat in meetings where the case against her husband was discussed as a piece of organizational context, the kind of background fact that shaped certain procedural decisions and resource allocations in ways that had to be acknowledged practically even while the investigation remained formally open. She sat in break rooms where people expressed opinions about him that ranged from supportive to damning, opinions formed entirely from public information and the organizational atmosphere rather than from any direct knowledge of the people or the events involved. She listened to all of it without expression, processing it the way you process something when you understand that your reaction to it, if visible, would end the only productive thing you currently have the ability to do about it. She started with the oldest records she could access, pulling the personnel files from the periods surrounding Renee's departure and Carol's departure and laying them out chronologically in a way that nobody in that department had apparently ever done before, not because it would have been difficult to do, but simply because nobody had ever had a reason to. Read individually and in isolation. The records told the stories they were designed to tell, the managed exits of 2 HR managers whose tenures had been troubled for reasons documented in the files. But read together, laid against each other in chronological sequence with attention to the origin and authorship of each piece of documentation, they told a different story entirely. The complaints against Renee had a signature in their language and their framing that appeared again, in different specific content but identical structural form, in the complaints against Carol. The process by which informal concerns had become formal documentation followed the same sequence in both cases, moving through the same informal channels, landing on the same desks, in the same general timeframe relative to the target's overall tenure. The person whose name appeared most consistently across the documentation of both situations, not as a complainant, but as a facilitator, a collector of testimony, a shaper of how concerns were framed and to whom they were directed, was the same name in both cases. Imani Carter. Aaliyah worked slowly and carefully, cross-referencing dates against meeting records and email logs available within the department's internal systems, building a timeline that mapped Imani's visible involvement against each stage of both women's departures. She was thorough in the way that someone is thorough when they understand that the document they are building is going to face the highest level of scrutiny and is going to need to withstand challenges from people who are motivated to find every possible flaw in it. She did not reach conclusions ahead of her evidence. She let the chronology speak for itself rather than imposing an interpretation onto it before the pattern was complete enough to support one. And as the weeks went on, the pattern became more complete and more undeniable with each additional piece she added to the picture. She reached out to Renee through a personal contact who knew both women from a professional association they had each been members of years earlier. She identified herself honestly, explained that she was Darnell Reeves's wife, explained what she was doing and why she was doing it, and asked if Renee would be willing to speak with her. She expected hesitation. She expected caution from a woman who had been through a difficult professional experience and had good reason to be careful about anything touching the same organization that had produced it. What she got was a long silence on the other end of the phone, and then the sound of someone who had been waiting for years for exactly this kind of call, without knowing it was something they were waiting for. Renee talked for a long time. She described her experience not just in terms of the formal record, but in terms of the atmosphere, the feeling of watching her own professional standing erode, without being able to locate the source of the erosion clearly enough to address it. She talked about the specific ways Imani had positioned herself during that period, always helpful, always present, always the first person to offer support when Renee was struggling with a situation, and always, she realized later, in exactly the right position to observe everything that could be observed and absorb everything that could be absorbed. She talked about the colleagues who had come to her after her resignation, some of them confused and some of them quietly guilty, to tell her that things they had said to Imani in casual conversation had apparently ended up documented somewhere in a form that neither they nor Renee had authorized or expected. She talked about the specific moment, near the end of her time at the company, when she had realized that the ground had already shifted entirely beneath her without her ever having the chance to stand firm on it. She talked about what it had cost her in the years since, not just professionally, but in the quieter ways that professional damage spreads into the rest of a person's life when it is sustained and unexplained and the person experiencing it cannot fully understand where it came from. Carol's account was obtained more carefully, through a written correspondence that gave Carol time to consider what she was sharing and in what form, and the account she eventually provided was strikingly similar to Renee's in its structural description of what had happened, while being entirely distinct in its specific details and its personal emotional content. The same patient build, the same calibrated distance between Imani and the most damaging documentation, the same withdrawal at the precise moment the process had built enough momentum to move on its own without her visible involvement. Carol also described the moment she had tried to raise a concern directly with a senior manager about what she had observed and been told to focus on her own performance rather than the motivations of her colleagues, a response that, in the context of everything else, now read less like reasonable managerial guidance and more like an organization that had been so thoroughly shaped by Imani's influence that its instinct, when confronted with a concern about her, was to redirect it rather than examine it. Aaliyah compiled everything across 7 weeks of careful work. The chronological documentation pattern, the accounts from Renee and Carol, the cross-reference timeline of Imani's involvement across both situations. A structural analysis showing how the pattern in the historical cases mapped against the pattern of the accusation against Darnell in ways that suggested the same operating logic across all 3 situations. She organized it into a format that could be read and understood by someone with no prior knowledge of any of the individuals involved or any of the history she had uncovered, a format that led a reader through the evidence step by step and let the pattern present itself rather than announcing its conclusion before the evidence had been laid out. She handed it to Darnell's legal team, explained how she had obtained it, and then waited while they spent 2 weeks working through its implications and determining how to introduce it in a way that would withstand everything that was going to come at it from the other side. During those 2 weeks, she continued going to work inside the HR department every day, doing her job, keeping her head down, and managing the particular kind of patience that is required when you can see something clearly but have to wait for the right moment to let it be seen by everyone else. The trial began on a Monday in early spring, and Imani Carter arrived at the courthouse on the first morning looking like a version of herself that had been calibrated specifically for this environment. Everything about her presentation said composure and credibility, from the way she held herself to the way she engaged with the people around her in the public areas outside the courtroom. A warmth that was appropriate without being performative, a gravity that matched the weight of the proceedings without suggesting the brittleness of someone who might crack under pressure. Her legal team had prepared her extensively. They had worked through her account until every element of it could be delivered consistently, until the emotional moments could be accessed reliably, without the kind of controlled quality that signals to experienced observers that an emotional response is being managed rather than felt. She had always been good at this. She had been doing a version of it her entire professional life. The courtroom was simply the highest stakes environment in which she had ever been called upon to perform it. The first portion of the trial belonged largely to the prosecution. Imani's account was presented with the full weight of its emotional content and its structural coherence, and the impact of it in the room was visible in the faces of the people around the courtroom who were hearing it for the first time with the full context of Imani's history and professional reputation. She took the stand when her time came and walked through her account with a clarity and a specific emotional authenticity that held the room in the way that certain testimonies hold a room, not because every person listening to it was certain it was true, but because it was coherent and detailed and delivered with the conviction of someone who believed what they were saying, or who was indistinguishable from someone who believed it, which is, in any given moment in a courtroom, exactly the same thing. And then Darnell's legal team began introducing the evidence that Aaliyah had spent 7 weeks building from inside the company's own records. They started with the personnel documentation from Renee's tenure, walking the court through the chronological record of how complaints against Renee had originated and how they had moved through the system toward their ultimate outcome, mapping each piece against the question of who had shaped it, framed it, collected the testimony that supported it, and directed it toward the people most likely to act on it. They introduced the corresponding documentation from Carol's tenure alongside it, presenting both timelines together in a way that made the structural similarity between them immediately and unavoidably visible. The judge called several procedural pauses during this presentation, not because anything improper was occurring, but because the volume and specificity of the documentation being introduced required careful management to ensure it was all formally entered into the record in a way that would stand up to every procedural challenge the other side was likely to raise against it. Renee took the stand and testified quietly, without dramatics, in the specific and grounded way of someone who has spent years understanding an experience and is now describing it with the clarity that understanding eventually produces. She described the atmosphere of her final months at the company in terms that were concrete rather than emotional, naming specific incidents, specific conversations, specific moments in which she had noticed things she could not fully interpret at the time and which had only made complete sense to her in the process of having them reflected back through the lens of everything that had happened since. She described Imani's role in that period with the specificity of someone who had done the work of memory, who had returned to those months and examined them from every available angle until she understood what she had been too busy surviving to fully see while she was inside them. Carol's testimony complemented Renee's without duplicating it, the way two honest accounts of overlapping experiences always complement each other while remaining distinct. She described the specific moment of trying to raise a concern with senior management and being redirected, a moment whose significance had grown in her understanding over the years as she had come to appreciate how completely that redirection had served the interests of the person she had been trying to raise the concern about. She described the specific quality of her last months in the department with a precision that made it clear she had also done the work of understanding what she had been through, and that the understanding had not softened the account, but made it sharper and more exact than it had been in the immediate aftermath. The cross-examination of Imani that followed all of this was the portion of the trial that most observers would identify afterward as the moment the case's direction became clear, though it did not happen in a single dramatic exchange. It happened in a series of smaller moments, each of them relatively contained and procedurally unremarkable on its own, that accumulated across several hours of testimony until their cumulative weight became something that could not be absorbed without conclusion. The questions were specific and sequential, drawn from a careful comparison of Imani's multiple previous accounts of the incident, the investigative interviews, the depositions, and the earlier sessions of trial testimony. The differences between those accounts, which had been noted individually across multiple contexts, were now being presented together in organized form for the first time, mapped against each other with the kind of specificity that makes the difference between the natural variability of honest recall and the inconsistency of a constructed account visible to anyone paying close attention. The time at which certain events occurred, the position of specific objects in the room relative to specific people at specific moments, the sequence in which things were said and done, the location of her phone, the state of the door. None of these discrepancies, presented individually, would have been sufficient to shift anything. Together, aligned and presented with the documentary support of multiple previous statements in front of a legal record that had to reflect them accurately, they produced something that the courtroom experienced not as a dramatic revelation, but as the slow and unmistakable settling of a picture into a form that was now difficult for anyone present to explain in the terms they had been using before. Imani's composure did not break. She did not cry or raise her voice or lose her temper in the way that courtroom confrontations sometimes produce those responses. What happened was subtler than that, and in some ways more telling. The quality of certainty that had characterized every aspect of her presentation from the first day of the trial began, over the course of that cross-examination, to shift into something else, something that resembled composure, but carried underneath it the slight quality of a person managing their surface more carefully than they had needed to manage it before. The people who had been watching her closely across the preceding days noticed it in the way you notice a change in temperature, not dramatically, but undeniably, and once noticed, impossible to unnotice in everything that came after. The formal dismissal of the case against Darnell came at the end of a week of deliberation that felt much longer than its calendar duration to everyone waiting on the outcome. The finding was unambiguous in its conclusion, though measured in its language, the way formal legal findings tend to be when the facts they are describing are considerably less measured than the words used to capture them. The case against Darnell Reeves was dismissed. The evidence introduced in his defense had not simply failed to support the accusation against him. It had produced, in the process of being introduced, a body of information about the person who had made the accusation that opened the door to a separate set of proceedings that would operate on their own timeline and through their own process, but whose direction was no longer a matter of serious uncertainty to anyone who had been present in that courtroom across the duration of the trial. Darnell Reeves was formally reinstated as director of the company on a Tuesday morning in early summer, several weeks after the trial's conclusion. The board's statement was carefully worded, carrying the professional language of institutional acknowledgement without the emotional weight of anything that might sound like an apology for what their earlier decision had cost him, though the people who knew what that decision had actually cost him understood the gap between those two things clearly. He returned to his office and spent his first morning back going through the months of accumulated correspondence and operational updates that had piled up in his absence, the work of a company that had continued running without him and that needed him to understand where it had gone while he was not there to see it. His portrait was still in the lobby, slightly to the left of the main entrance, in the same position it had always occupied. He stopped in front of it for a moment on his way through, not long, just long enough for the people nearby to notice that he had looked at it. And then he kept walking, because there was work to do, and he had never been the kind of person who needed to stand in the lobby examining evidence of his own existence in order to feel that it was real. The reinstatement restored his title. It restored his formal standing within the company and within the industry. It produced a wave of public acknowledgement from people who had been quiet during the hardest months and who now found it comfortable to be vocal again. A wave that Aaliyah watched with an expression that the few people close enough to see it would have recognized as the specific expression of a woman who was being too polite to say what she was actually thinking out loud. The restoration of a reputation after a public accusation is not the same thing as the original reputation. The original reputation is a clean surface. The restored reputation is the same surface after the work of cleaning, and anyone who looks at it under the right light can see where the cleaning was done. That is not a complaint about the justice system. It is simply the truth about what public accusation does to a person's professional identity regardless of its outcome, and anyone telling this story honestly has to say it directly rather than letting the legal vindication stand in for a kind of wholeness that legal vindication cannot actually restore. Renee and Carol received formal acknowledgement from the company, handled privately and through legal representatives, that the circumstances of their respective departures had not reflected their professional conduct or their professional capability, but had been the product of an external interference with the systems that were supposed to protect them. The specific terms of those acknowledgments are not public. Both women have spoken, to people close to them, about the experience of having something named officially that they had spent years carrying without a name, and both have described the naming as matching in ways that were distinct from whatever practical acknowledgments accompanied it, because the practical acknowledgments addressed what had been lost while the naming addressed something that practical acknowledgment alone cannot reach. The proceedings against Imani Carter moved through their own timeline and produced their own outcome, which was reached without the sustained public attention that had surrounded the original case. That is almost always how it happens. The allegation that breaks into headlines first commands an audience that the correction rarely fully inherits, and the proceedings arising from the correction of a false allegation command an even smaller portion of that audience than the correction itself. She was found liable. Her career in HR, in the industry, and in any professional environment where her name could be searched and found attached to this story was effectively over. She was last publicly traceable through the court proceedings and has not been heard from in any professional context since. Aaliyah returned her access badge to the front desk of the company she had co-founded on a Friday afternoon, and Darnell was waiting in the car park to drive her home. Some of the people she had worked alongside in the HR department learned afterward, through the coverage of the trial, who she had actually been during those months, and their reactions ranged from surprise to quietly awed to the particular kind of retrospective admiration that arises when people realize they have been working alongside a larger story than the one they understood at the time. The department head who had managed her during her time there said publicly, afterward, that she had been one of the most thorough and attentive people he had ever had in that role, and that he wished, sincerely, that the circumstances producing that thoroughness had been different. Here is what stays with you about this story long after the verdict, the reinstatement, and the quiet disappearance of Imani Carter from the professional world she spent years learning to navigate in ways it was never designed to be navigated. The pattern was always there. It was sitting in the documentation from the moment Renee's resignation hit an HR desk. It was visible in the timing of Carol's departure relative to everything that preceded it. It was present, consistently and specifically, across every situation Imani had touched in a way that should have been visible to anyone who had taken the time to look at all three situations together rather than processing each one in isolation as it arrived. The reason nobody looked at them together is not a mystery. It is the oldest organizational vulnerability there is. The person most capable of connecting the pattern was also the person who was producing it, and the systems designed to catch that kind of thing depend on the people operating them being outside the problem rather than at the center of it. What finally stopped Imani Carter was not a system working the way it had been designed to work. It was one person operating outside the expected channels, doing the slow and unglamorous work of laying pieces of information next to each other and looking at them long enough to see what they actually said rather than what they appeared to say in isolation. Aaliyah Reeves did not go into that building with a dramatic plan. She went in with genuine professional capability, a legal notepad, and a willingness to sit with information until the information itself showed her what she had come to find. The truth was in the files the entire time. It had been sitting there through every investigation, every resignation, every legal proceeding. It just needed someone who was not going to be redirected when the looking got uncomfortable, and who was patient enough to let the pattern complete itself before declaring what she had found. There is a version of this story where none of what Aaliyah did was necessary, where the systems inside that organization had done their job the way they were built to do it, where Renee's exit or Carol's exit or both of them together had triggered the kind of review that would have surfaced the pattern before Imani ever reached the point of making an accusation against Darnell. That version of the story did not happen. And the reason it did not happen is the same reason similar situations play out in organizations every day without anyone connecting what they are watching until the cost is already higher than anyone wanted to pay. Most organizations are not built to look at their own patterns critically while those patterns are still forming. They are built to address situations as they present themselves, one at a time, in the context available at that moment, and a person who understands that can use the structure of an organization against itself for a very long time before anyone is in a position to see what has been happening across the full timeline. So here is the question worth sitting with after this story ends. How many workplaces, right now today, have someone operating a version of this pattern inside them, patiently and quietly, and with the full trust of the people around them? Would you have connected those dots before the third situation emerged? Would you have been the person who raised the concern that kept being redirected, or would you have been the person doing the redirecting without understanding what you were actually protecting? And if someone came to you with an account of something they could feel but could not yet fully prove, would you be the person who told them to stay in their lane, or the person who sat down with them and looked at the files? Let us know in the comments what you think about this story. Tell us where in the timeline you first started to feel that something was not right about Imani Carter. Tell us what you would have done differently, and what you think the people around her should have caught earlier. And let us know where you are watching from right now, because this community stretches across every state, and every time zone, and every story we bring you lands differently, depending on where you are sitting when you hear it. If this video held your attention from the first second to this one, the best thing you can do right now is follow or hit that subscribe button so you are here when we drop the next one. Because what we are bringing you next is the kind of story that makes you look at the people around you completely differently, and you are absolutely going to want to be here for it.